Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the philosophy show where we examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented by the mainstream narrative. Hi there, my name's Nigel Howitt, and today we're going to look at arguably the most important tool that we have for interpreting our world, for working out what we should do, how we should live, and indeed for managing our lives. And joining me to discuss this, it's a great pleasure to welcome fellow philosopher Razi Ginzberg, founder of the Ayn Rand Centre in London. Razi, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and I do hope I've pronounced your name right, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Great stuff. Razi, maybe you could start us by telling us how you got interested in this really useful science called philosophy, which tends to sort of most people shy away from through, might think it's boring or it's whatever. How did you get into it, and what's your come from?
So I started reading philosophy when I was 15. I don't actually remember the exact reason for it. I think it might have been, the influence of some celebrity that I liked who recommended it. And then about 4 years later, when I was 19, I first came across Ayn Rand. I'd heard of her before, but I was more of a nonfiction reader. And all I heard about was her two major novels. So I had never read her until then. Then I came across a nonfiction collection of essays in a bookstore. I picked it up. I think within a couple of years, I read almost everything she wrote, including the novels. Which I hadn't actually intended to read, but she does quote from them in her nonfiction, and I usually skip those parts to avoid spoilers, and at some point I was like, I need to read them as well. So that's how I got in initially. Yeah,
it's interesting. I discovered, I've always had an interest in philosophy from way back in the early 90s, but I only really discovered Rand's thinking about 3 or 4 years ago, so I'm a relative newbie, but it really struck me as being phenomenally useful and spot on. I'd been exploring and examining why there's so much disinformation and propaganda put out, why are so many things we're told upside down and back to front, and I'd been trying to get to the fundamentals, and Rand showed me how to get to the fundamentals. That was really the big one for me. So Razi, how do you how would you describe philosophy to a newbie or a newcomer? How would you describe and why it's such a useful subject, even though it might sound off-putting to some?
So I think philosophy is sort of the generalized field of understanding how we think and how we act, and I think. It is misunderstood. I think most people think of, when they think of philosophy, they think of gibberish with big words that are intended to people used to sound intelligent by saying things that nobody can understand. And this is where Rand really takes things in a different direction, because she says that reality is knowable, that our mind is our tool of understanding it. And that actually might be, because she is, you read her and you understand what she is saying, and it makes sense. I think that's maybe one of the big reasons why she's rejected as a philosopher in academia, and why you only heard of her 3 or 4 years ago rather than.
I mean, it stands to reason that anybody that really, gets to the root of things and identifies some core things that are wrong. The essence of a philosophy being reason, as being, I know it's a very broad abstraction, but reason and rationality as being the best thing that we humans can do, and the means through which we can solve all our problems. So I found this really attractive, but you can see how that would upset a lot of people, because if you're sort of uncovering untruth, if you're taking that sort of screen of impressive sounding words away from all those abstract philosophers that are just talking nonsense, it's understandable, isn't it, that she's going to ruffle a few feathers, and she did. She attracted, I believe, some quite hostile enemies as well as loyal supporters.
By the way, I should have mentioned this in my answer before, but yeah, and it's a slight correction to your introduction of me. I'm not a philosopher or a professional intellectual, and I know you've had Jerome Brooke and Don Watkins on your show, and they're both objectivist intellectuals. There are many other very good ones. So yeah, I'm a student of her philosophy. I think I have a good enough grasp of it. As you know, I run discussion groups about her ideas here in the UK and at events. But yeah, I do need to add that caveat.
I consider myself a student as well. I'm no professional academic or anything like that, but I rather liked one of Rand's books, for the new intellectual, where she literally calls the likes of you and I and anyone listening, anyone who's interested in making a better world, anyone who's interested in finding out the truth. She calls us to be the new intellectuals, and I suppose I perhaps I'm flattering myself, but I'd like to think that I was helping to fulfil that role and in spreading ideas that I think really can make a difference. One of the things that Rand said to me, I found most profound was that the idea that we all have a philosophy, we don't have any choice about that. We only have three choices around it: either one, that we're conscious of it; two, that we chose it ourselves; or three, that it's true or not. So these are the only areas with which you have a choice about philosophy. I found this a fascinating insight that everyone out there is going around with a philosophy of some sort, and I like to think of a philosophy as a mental operating system, as a sort of a collection of probably beliefs for most people rather than convictions, and we'll talk about the difference between those in a second. But most people have a collection of beliefs about the way things are, about the nature of reality, about their own nature, about how human beings should interact, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. And this is their sort of their philosophy, although a lot of it might contradict itself. It's not a thought out complete system, as it were. And I found this a really interesting insight from Rand. I found it very helpful. Oh my goodness, I do have a philosophy. I wonder what it is, and that set me on a journey of introspection, if you like.
Rand said that she advocated free will, and she said that the essence of free will is the choice to focus your mind or to evade the task of focusing your mind. So, and I think, yeah, everybody has a philosophy, and then your choice is whether you accept whatever you absorbed from your parents, your teachers, society, or whoever, or blindly reject it and just go the opposite way without thinking about it, or you actually use your mind to discover the facts of reality and decide on a course of action based on that. So it's not automatic. It takes a lot of work.
What do you think are the key areas of Ayn Rand's ideas and objectivism that made you think, yep, that's the one for me? What are the best parts of it, if you like?
Well, I think for me the big selling point, and that's also what I try to present as the big selling point when I promote the ideas here in the UK, is the idea that your life belongs to you, because of the different views that we have out there about religion, about politics, and so on. There's not much challenge to the idea. Not many are challenging the idea that your life does not belong to you. They just disagree on who it does belong to, whether you need to sacrifice to God, to the state, or society, or the race, or the planet, or any and all of the above. The idea that you can live for yourself and you should live for yourself, and that is the right thing to do for you. And as a byproduct of that, others do benefit, but that's not the essence of it.
Absolutely,
that was most attractive.
Yeah, I would agree with that, doesn't it? Because I mean that paves the way for freedom and everything. The fact that man has the right, man as in terms of the species rather than the gender use of the term, man has the right to his own life is really, really right there, as a fundamental and being massively important, isn't it? Because I mean, for those that don't know about philosophy, the ethics has to come first. Any political system, any school of political science is necessarily rooted in an ethics, in a morality, and almost all of the politics that we see today is rooted in altruism, this sort of age-old idea that we do not have the right to live for ourselves. I mean, I was raised a Catholic, Christian, and of the Catholic denomination, and it was very much drummed into me that my purpose and my highest possible virtue is to sacrifice for others, and ultimately for God. I never quite understood what they were talking about when they said that, but it's been drummed into me, as I think it has to all of us, that sacrifice is the good. So being prepared to live for others, to give up for the tribe, for the government, for the collective.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the alternative that's presented to that is selfishness, but not in the sense that Rand used that term, in the sense of what would be called a package deal, which the use of selfishness. If you use the word selfishness with most people today, they'll think of stepping on others to rise to the top. They think essentially of life as a zero-sum game in which everybody's your enemy.
People barging in the queues and grabbing the best seat and taking it all first. That's what people think of it.
Yeah, whereas in Rand's idea of rational self-interest, you have it is within your interest to deal with others and exchange value for value, which he called the trader principle, which applies not only to financial transactions and trade of goods, but spiritually as well. Somebody, a friend is of value to you. It is an exchange. So that, again, unfortunately, is something that is not an idea that's widespread enough that is actually a possible and right way to live. To deal with those who you see as of value to you and you're of value to them, and those who are not, and you let them do their thing and you do yours.
So there's sort of a false dichotomy there, isn't there? That's in the typically sort of out there in the matrix, most people view the idea of sacrifice as an either-or thing. Either you sacrifice yourself to others, or you get sacrificed. And I think Objectivism would say that there's no need for sacrifice, guys. Nobody needs to sacrifice or be sacrificed to anyone or anything, which is really sort of lifting the game up to a new level, isn't it? I find that very exciting. But it's so difficult to speak of selfishness without people hearing evil, my goodness. I mean, everybody is so conditioned, and this comes back to my whole interest with our conditioning, and why is it we're so predisposed to sort of follow the flock and be what Nathaniel Branden referred to as a social metaphysicist, this idea that you sort of look to the group for your instructions on how to live and for all of your guidance. But it's very polarized, isn't it, this idea of selfishness, and I think we've probably got a long way to go to explain that rational self-interest. How do you define selfish now? It's concern for one's own interest, isn't it? Selfishness. So on the face of that, that's pretty harmless, isn't it? To be concerned for your own self-interest, you have to be to live a life. You have to be focused on your self-interest. Do you think do you see people in your walk of life, Razi? Do you see people relatively open to this argument of reinterpreting selfishness?
Now that I run the Ayn Rand Center UK, I often encounter such people at events that I run, because if they come to an Ayn Rand Center event, there's a good chance that that they'll be open to it. On your question of how we, how it is that nobody is willing to listen to these ideas generally, that's thousands of years of philosophy that has been very successful in beating it out of people. And yeah, it'll take a while. I mean, we're recording this 10 days before a general election. Nobody with good ideas is going to be elected in that election. The question is, how bad the person who is elected is. Many events that I run are lectures about psychology, and psychology is the field that people go to mostly if they want to be happy, because they think, as we mentioned, they think of philosophy as gibberish, and they think of psychology as a science in which you can discover how to be happy. So I think that might be one of the ways in which to get people to think about ideas as well, to tie in psychology to philosophy, to ideas, to tie the subconscious to the conscious, and show that you choose the ideas you hold, and that will have an effect on whether or not you're happy. So people do want to pursue their own happiness. They just don't want to think of their pursuit of their own happiness as selfishness, because that's people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Craig Biddle of the Objectivist Standard over there in the States, he has pointed out that the whole self-help industry, the whole industry around self-improvement, personal growth, personal development, whatever we call it, is essentially a selfish industry, by the strict definition of the term, which I thought it's almost amusing to point that out. But of course, it's perfectly legitimate, as we can see when we look at it rationally, it's perfectly legitimate to pursue one's interests, and happiness a key part of that. It seems a shame that people would shun philosophy for psychology, or maybe that's not quite what you said. Maybe they start with psychology, because philosophy really does have the sort of the foundation, isn't it? If reality is an objective absolute, if you can know it, and if it's okay to live your own life for your own sake, these are really firm foundations from which to pursue happiness. And Rand's ideas on emotions, I mean, I think they're one of her most enormous gifts to me. When I read her thinking on the relationship between thought and emotion, and the cause and effect nature, and the fact that emotions depend on our values, I found this incredibly empowering. It's like suddenly getting, the horses in front of the cart instead of behind. It's like, oh yes, right, now this thing works. So I mean, in terms of people pursuing happiness, it's difficult to recommend Rand's ideas more highly from my perspective in terms of understanding our emotions.
Most people first hear of Rand probably through her politics, and politics is not an area that people go into conversations about wanting to learn. People go in for a fight, and they want to win, and if they don't win, they lose. With what I do with the weekly discussion group that I organize in London, and the less frequent ones outside of London, and the speaker events. I know the one you attended was about politics. We're doing a few of those, but generally I try to steer clear of that. Focus mostly on ethics, on psychology, some epistemology, metaphysics, and art, and then the occasional discussion of politics, which often gets more rowdy than art.
I love it the way people generally say that you mustn't talk about religion, you mustn't talk about sex, and you mustn't talk about politics. They're arguably three of the most important things really that we should know about and talk about, and get all these buried issues ahead about, and yet they're the taboos. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that the elections coming up here in the UK. It's 2nd of December today, and we got an election coming up on the 12th. There's another classic sort of false dichotomy, isn't there? Either you choose this version of statism or that version of statism. It doesn't look like the British people have got much of a choice, does it, Razi?
No. I was. I watched the last Prime Minister's questions before Parliament dissolved, and I was half listening, half asking myself why I'm doing that to myself. But I did manage to hear a question from, I think it was a Labour MP. This was early November, so there were fireworks, and whenever there's fireworks, there are calls to ban fireworks. So somebody asked the Prime Minister about that, and he said, this is why we need to get Brexit done, so we can do things like ban fireworks because the EU won't let us. And I think Brexit is the right thing to do, but I don't doubt that politicians will find a way to make things worse after Brexit than they are today. There will be there are some advantages to the EU, which I think we can actually keep unilaterally. But yeah, politicians in this country will perhaps be more accountable, definitely be more accountable than the EU is. But they'll also have more of more ability to ban things, and I keep seeing this from the Conservatives. They are proud of they make lists of the things they're going to ban. They already have a long list of things they've banned. They've been in power for 10 years. They introduced nanny-state legislation like the sugar tax, the ban on plastic straws, the recent ban on fracking. And you look at all that, and then you think that's the lesser of the two evils. So just imagine what we might get if you get the other option, which I think people underestimate the likelihood. They're behind in the polls, maybe hoping they're not going to get elected, but I think that is a possibility, and I think.
You mean Corbyn, don't you? And the Labour Party or the Socialists?
Yeah, and I think people need to realize this is not, this is not a drill. Like they're hardcore. This is not like Tony Blair's Labour. They are hardcore socialists. So maybe they're not going to nationalize every corner shop, but and maybe the Jews aren't going to be sent to gas chambers. But it will be very bad, and it will be very, very difficult to claw our way out of it after 5 years of
absolutely
Marxists in power.
This is where Rand's ideas are very informative because her thinking and her political theory of capitalism is hugely misrepresented. Of course, it's another dirty word. Say the word capitalism, and everybody sort of throws rocks at you. But this is just a huge misrepresentation. It's staggering how a concept that represents a political, socio-economic system in which people's right to live for their own sake, their right to be free, is actually recognized. It's the only political system that I know of in which that's the case. It answers yes to the question, is man free? and yet it is bad-mouthed, misunderstood, and everybody condemns capitalism. It's very, very back to front and quite bizarre for those of us that understand these things. But it does give us, for those people that are familiar with Rand's ideas and her, and I can refer you to a video. I'll put a link into her actually explaining capitalism in her own words, and it's beautiful. But it does give us a window into this election where you see two forms of statism, one slightly less bad than the other, which are both advocating taking our freedoms away, banning things. The notion that the way to achieve a perfect society is to make all these rules and then enforce them on people rather than educate and allow people to be free. And it's deeply messed up, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is again one of those areas where you hear a debate between politicians. They disagree on a lot of the particulars, but again on the fundamentals, they all agree about what the role of government is, which is, we're basically all way too stupid to know how to run our own lives. So we should thank our lucky stars that we have these politicians to run our lives for us. And we're too stupid to understand that Coke has more sugar than Coke Zero. So they'll tax it a little bit and save us from ourselves in that respect. And again, the same with plastic straws and bags. And
but we're wise enough to know who to vote for, though, aren't we? I mean, this is the sort of absurdity of it, is that the general sort of statist premise is that we're all too stupid, and we need to be beaten with a stick to do the right thing, and we need to be corralled, carrot and stick. And yet, allegedly, the average member of the electorate is wise enough to discern between the two options, and it's rather limiting, isn't it? The whole political debate is pretty much the same across the Western world. But of all the different issues, you're unlikely between two candidates to find one that's going to, even if assuming you're not even looking at the fundamentals. I'd like freedom, please. No, that one's not on the table. But even with all these trivial issues, and oh yes, I think they should ban fox hunting, and then they should ban this. You're not likely to find one candidate or one party that you could, wholeheartedly back anyway. So it does seem an insane system.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a very long process. Changing the culture is definitely not going to happen by this election 10 days from now. It's not going to happen by the next few elections. It's a very, very long process. You have to fundamentally change the way people think about their own lives first and foremost, and from there you get the ball rolling.
If we're to spread the predominance of reason through our society, if we're to get people to be more rational, to think things through, how do you think, or what do you think is the best approach, Razi? Where do you think are the sort of buttons to aim to press? Where do you go if you are trying to persuade someone?
Discussing ideas is a very good way to do that. I think so. Not just in politics, but in culture. Basically, the level of discourse is quite low. It is quite sort of. It sticks to these sort of catchphrases and terms that are often very badly misused, and then there's nowhere to go from there. So first of all, I think you need a very clear definition of terms and topics that you're discussing, and then you need a framework, a starting point. So Rand in her ethics says that the standard of value is life. So for example, when you talk to environmentalists, that's an important point, because if their standard of value is that we need to keep nature untouched, then untouched by man, then it's very difficult to have a conversation. I know you spoke to Don Watkins about it, and I know the Center for Industrial Progress is doing great work on that in America.
Yep.
Here there is basically very little discussion of that. We had the Extinction Rebellion protests a couple of months ago, and I thought one of their leaders was on Piers Morgan's show, and he questioned her very well. He said, do your kids have iPads? Do you have a TV at home? And she said, this is not about what any individual can do. This is on a society level. So this is an approach that people take and they think is right. So most people agree with environmentalism, and
most people agree with environmentalism in that they like the idea of a clean environment. I mean, who wouldn't? It's just when you pin them down to that standard of good of environmentalism that it all changes, isn't it? So it's an easy bandwagon to jump onto, isn't it? Let's all work for the environment. That's really easy to get people in on. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
If there's a magic button that politicians can push, that we can have the same standard of living that we have without any pollution or any CO2 emissions, then I think that's kind of what people think environmentalism will lead to. But that's not how innovation works. We didn't come across fossil fuels because because governments banned burning wood or whatever people were doing before.
Yeah.
This is it was freedom that led to innovation. So and people don't think that way. But the point about people being rational, I think people are to a very large extent rational, at least in the way they act, because if they wouldn't be, they would perish ultimately.
Yep.
So when I talk to environmentalists, and this is including the most extreme environmentalists that I know, I always say to them that I agree with them completely, but I agree with them completely in their actions, in the way they choose to live their life, which is going on vacation 5 or 6 times a year, using all the wonderful benefits of fossil fuels. I don't agree with what they're preaching, but I agree with what they're practicing. So.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with what they're preaching when they start talking about the harmful effects of CO2, but that's a whole other debate, because there are a lot of facts of reality that actually undermine their debate. But I do agree that having a clean environment and looking after the environment is essential. I mean, I do consider myself an environmentalist. I run an organic smallholding here, and I'm very concerned about species extinction. But of course, it doesn't have anything to do with burning fossil fuels. And this leads me back to one of the fantastic insights of Rand's ideas, is that, in getting to the fundamentals, her ideas have taught me to separate the issues. And a classic mixture of issues in the environmental debate is CO2 and its, allegedly its effects. It does have effects. It is a greenhouse gas. It does have some warming effect, and pollution. But they're two separate issues. So pollution, absolutely bad news. I mean, nobody would want to inhale nasty toxic particulates, or things like glyphosate that's sprayed all over the fields and the crops. I consider that a dreadfully anti-life pollutant. So pollution on one side, a really, really good thing to be against. We can all rally behind that. CO2 and its alleged, irreversible effects on climate change is another thing. So it's really important to separate issues. That's just one example. And I find when I'm talking to people today, a lot of the time issues are just intertwined, and particularly causes and effects are intertwined. So you can talk to somebody and they'll be describing an effect of loss of freedom. So we've got loss of freedom upstream here, and it results in these things, and there's an effect. There's lots of negative effects when we lose our freedom. But then one of these effects will be cited as a reason why we can't have freedom. It'll be cited as an argument against capitalism. Or you can't, and it is difficult to know where to go when you're presented with a situation like that, because there's a lot of, you've got to back up several blocks, haven't you, and think, whoa, hang on, where can we start? Where's our common ground to start on here?
Yeah, and Alex Epstein points this out in the Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, that you need to have a cost-benefit analysis of things. So for example, with pollution, of course, as such, out of context, it's a negative thing. But when I read about all the people who died supposedly from pollution in the city, I always ask, as opposed to what? As opposed to not having any energy and plowing the fields 16 hours a day, every day of their life. So it all needs to be taken in a certain context. And, the cleaner the energy, the better. But it is very good that we have enough energy to sustain ourselves, and it would be and beyond. And it would be great if that was extended to the parts of the world where they don't have that.
It leads me to another one of those illuminating sort of gems from Ayn Rand, and that is to hold context. Remember to always hold context. There's no such thing as knowledge outside of context, and when we drop context, everything goes pear-shaped. We have to hold the full context of any decision or anything we're actually choosing to do. And we seem to have lost and dropped the context of where we've come from, and obviously understandably, but people don't appreciate that only 500, 600, 700 years ago, most of us lived in abject poverty, and today, anyone's home is a palace compared to the way that kings and queens lived in the Middle Ages, with running water and toilet paper and bathrooms and, radios and TVs and computers. And, it's mind-bendingly different today and better today than it was back then when we weren't burning any fossil fuels. And the whole industrial revolution and all these things are all part of the context that is readily discarded, and it is understandable. Education doesn't provide young people with anything like the appropriate context that it should. And, education doesn't even tell us about philosophy. It doesn't even tell us about the importance of thinking. So we've got quite a way to go, haven't we, in terms of shaping society in a positive way.
Yeah. Education, the education system now is used to terrify kids into thinking that the world is coming to an end in 12 years or 12 months. I don't know what the latest timeline is, but. When I see these kids protesting, obviously, I don't blame a 12-year-old for their views. I blame the adults around that 12-year-old.
Yeah, it is rather alarming. I mean, in my small circle of my young lad, all my children are homeschooled, and they are they visit a forest school on occasion, and they're surrounded by a lot of other children that do all still think that they're all on board with Extinction Rebellion. Basically, they all think that this climate alarmist doomsday sort of scenario is true. They're so heftily bought into it, and it's a shame, isn't it? It's I mean, these are even home educated children, for God's sake. It's sometimes difficult to know where to start, isn't it?
Yeah, I was attending a panel. I was in the audience in a panel about Extinction Rebellion at Battle of Ideas about a month ago. And one of the so there were two environmentalists and two non-environmentalists on the panel, and one of the environmentalists said at some point we need to stop progress, and at another point he said that in order to combat this danger, we need to reduce the human population by a third. And so there's a lot of terrifying, underlying ideas in this movement that maybe the more storefront stuff that we hear from them doesn't fully convey. But I think many of the ideological leaders of the movement are really very much anti-human at the core. And we should pay attention to them because the rest are to follow.
I think that's a very useful thing to identify, isn't it? To try and paint that picture that this is coming from an anti-human agenda, because a lot of these things are just simply false. I mean, I can remember the James Lovelock and his Gaia theory, and he said some worthwhile things, not necessarily knocking him, but from that came this idea that we need 3 planets to feed the population. But these things are just not true. When you see vast monocultures on the fields of England of growing 3 arguably pointless crops, wheat, field beans, and rapeseed for canola oil, a pointless vegetable oil that should never be consumed. When you contrast that with land use practices such as permaculture and multi-layering and forest gardens, the potential when human ingenuity and thinking, when we're allowed to solve our own problems, free of government restriction, the potential to feed ourselves is enormous. And I drive around the countryside here. I'm just north of London, about 30 miles north, and there are so many verges and areas, and you think, well, where's the food growing? And it isn't. There's wheat fields, but there's a lot of information that says that wheat is it's well worth not eating wheat, basically. So when you bear all these factors in, it's these they're just false ideas. They're just wrong, aren't they? And they're anti-life, as you say.
Yeah, and they're also not new. I mean, for at least hundreds of years, this concern about overpopulation and depletion of resources has been around. And yeah, there is no shortage of resources. I don't know if these people realize how massive the Earth is and how much resources there are, and how the ultimate resource, which is the human mind, finds a way to make the most of what there is. As for 3 planets, we will at some point go beyond this one, and but why not? So,
well, yeah. I mean, I think this is a beautiful place, and I'm set on making this planet as good as it can be. But my experience at organic farming and permaculture has shown me that land can be so much more productive than it is. So this is just not true when we hear these doom and gloom messages you were referring to there, and then when we also hear the nonsense about CO2 and the fact that we're all going to die, and these young children, being terrified into, I mean, it must be horrendous. I mean, I couldn't imagine being 12, 13, young teenager or whatever, and being concerned that, your planet is going to, it's going to be some sort of climatic disaster. It's shocking. It's wrong that this false information should be used for these evil purposes of causing ultimately, a lot of serious stress to a whole generation of young children.
Yeah, it's not okay, and again, it's the adults' fault. In the case of children, who I believe are genuinely terrified and genuinely believe this because this is what the grown-ups say. So
yeah, I mean, and coming back to Rand's ideas, the point is that reality is knowable, and I think a lot of people throw their hands up in the air and think, oh, so much, you could, what can I do, and how can I know, all the scientists and experts disagree. But I think that Ayn Rand's ideas have certainly, they can foster the correct belief that reality is knowable. It is possible to weigh up arguments and using our faculty of reason to judge, to actively judge, to take responsibility to judge what is right, what's wrong. That person says that, the other says that. Which one do I agree with? And I think a lot of that's been drummed out of children through education, but maybe that's an area that we need to try and foster, isn't it, in these conversations that we have out there, to try and make the world a better place and make everybody more rational. Well, not make them more rational, but encourage more rationality, I should say.
Yeah, and I think the point, the distinction Rand made in her essay, "The Metaphysical versus the Man-Made," is crucial here.
Yeah.
Which is, you need to understand that there are things in reality that humans can act upon to improve nature for our sake, and then there are things that we cannot do. We can't. If it's I don't know, if it's too hot, we can't push the sun away a little bit. There are things we can't that are not within our power to do. But there's so much that we can do, and we need to understand what it is. So, in some of this discussion about climate change, when they talk about precise temperatures and precise dates, I mean, from what I can understand, and I'm not a scientist, there is an impact of CO2 on temperatures. But there are other things that impact temperatures. So this idea that politicians can fly in their private jets to these summits to talk about how we should restrict flying and other things to determine a precise temperature at which we'll all be fine sounds a bit out there to me.
It certainly does.
Other such examples.
Yeah, no, I think it's great that you draw attention to that essay, the distinction between the man-made and the metaphysical, because the blurring of these boundaries, I think, is responsible for a lot of the modern sort of neo-mysticism and the idea that we create our own reality, this sort of subjectivism sort of idea creeping in. And it's such a sort of a murky thing. Again, the issues need to be separated because there's a lot that we have control over. We have control over our knowledge base, the context of our knowledge, the way we perceive things, our mindset, our attitude, whether or not we choose to think. There's so many things we have control over, and yet, you can't sort of, affect things, and, you can't literally create matter out of nothing. You can't destroy it. As you said, there are things we just can't do, and there's such a blurring of the boundaries that I just see a lot of confusion resulting, and it seems to me through that confusion, mysticism seems to sort of slip in through the fog.
So back to why philosophy matters. So ultimately, these ideas they seep into sciences, they seep into physics, they seep into psychology. I think we see that with evolutionary psychology very strongly. The taking certain ideas from biology and taking somewhat of a leap into psychology that I don't know if the actual connection in reality is there and justifies it, but it is used to ultimately deny free will and So ultimately, philosophy is at the base of all that, of how we think about thinking, of how we think about using our mind, and the wrong philosophy will lead to the wrong thinking.
Absolutely. Well, Razi, maybe just to wind it up, just aware of time here, just to remind people, any interested listeners, particularly here in the UK, about how they can get involved with one of your meetups.
Yeah, so the Ayn Rand Centre UK runs a weekly discussion group in London. You can find it on the London Ayn Rand meetup. If you just Google that, you'll find it. And we have 9 other groups around the country that meet less frequently. We also have events where objectivist speakers, a couple of speakers in the UK and many speakers from abroad speak often in panels. I really like events where the objectivist view is contrasted with a different view. We run many events, and we're planning to run many more. So I hope people will join us at these events. And if anybody wants to support our work so we can do more events, they can go to aynrandcenter.co.uk/membership. And our membership program is a way in which we fund much of it.
Fantastic. Well, Razi, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate your thoughts and your views on these wonderful ideas of Ayn Rand and on the importance and usefulness of philosophy in general. Really appreciate that, mate.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
No worries. And thank you very much for listening. I do urge you to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com, and check out everything there. There's a lot of stuff on there to help you take control of your life, a lot of philosophical stuff and useful health information. So thank you very much for listening, and do join us again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.